The classroom was silent except for the ticking clock and the occasional sigh of frustration. At the back of the room, Liam Carter slumped over his desk, staring blankly at yet another failed test, his fourth that semester. The red ink screamed. At him. 47%. See me after class. He didn't need to look up to know the other students were exchanging glances, some smirking, others shaking their heads. He was used to it by now. Liam had become the school's cautionary tale. The kid who couldn't pass no matter how many times he tried. Teachers whispered about him in the staff room, calling him unmotivated, distracted, or worse, a lost cause. Even his parents had stopped asking about his grades, their disappointment replaced by resigned silence. The only person who still spoke to him with any regularity was the janitor, old Mr. Riley, who'd slip him candy and say, "Grades don't measure what's up here, kid," tapping his temple. But what no one knew was what happened when Liam got home. While his classmates buried themselves in textbooks, Liam buried himself in broken electronics, old radios, discarded laptops, anything he could scavenge from thrift stores or dumpsters. His bedroom looked like a mad scientist's lab. Wires and circuit boards strewn across his bed, his walls plastered with notes on coding languages he'd taught himself from library books. One night, after another humiliating parent-teacher meeting, his math teacher, Mr. Dalton, had said loud enough for everyone to hear, "Some kids just aren't built for success." That night, Liam didn't sleep. Instead, he dismantled an old tablet, repaired its cracked screen, and spent hours writing lines of code for an idea he'd been too afraid to share, an app that could simplify accounting for small businesses. He had no way of knowing then that this would be the first step toward a future no one, least of all his teachers, could have imagined. The app started as a mess of code and stubborn hope, a jumble of ideas Liam barely understood himself, but he kept at it, night after night, fueled by the kind of desperation that turns doubt into determination. His parents, worn down by years of teacher complaints and pitying looks from neighbors, had all but given up on him. So when he told them he was dropping out at 19, their silence was heavier than any argument. The school didn't even try to stop him. His counselor just slid the paperwork across the desk with a tired smile, as if relieved to finally close the file on a lost case. But Liam wasn't thinking about what he was leaving behind. He was fixated on what he could build. He spent months living off instant noodles and stolen Wi-Fi from the library parking lot, refining his app in the back corner of a dingy internet cafe where the owner, a gruff ex-mechanic named Gus, let him work in exchange for fixing his ancient laptop. The app was crude, barely functional at first, but it did one thing well. It tracked money, incoming, outgoing, profits, losses, in a way that even Gus, who still kept his books in a grease-stained notebook, could understand. When Gus started using it for his auto shop, word spread to the struggling bakery next door, then the thrift store down the block, and suddenly Liam wasn't just a dropout. He was the guy who solved problems no one else had bothered to notice. By the end of that year, he'd patched together a small team of fellow misfits, a community college dropout who could design better than any art student, a self-taught hacker who'd been expelled for testing his school's security system, and a single mom who managed orders while her toddler napped in a carrier on her back. They worked out of a borrowed garage, their office lit by a single flickering bulb, but for the first time in his life, Liam felt like he belonged somewhere. And then, just as the app, now called Ledgerlight, started gaining real traction. In their scrappy little town, Liam got a call from a tech investor who'd stumbled across it while visiting family. The man offered him a meeting, and Liam, wearing his only button-up shirt, stained with coffee and too tight at the shoulders, pitched his idea with the nervous energy of someone who'd spent years being told he had nothing valuable to say. The investor didn't care about his lack of degree or his failed school history. He cared that the app worked, that real businesses were thriving because of it, and that Liam understood the people using it in a way no polished Silicon Valley founder ever could. When the deal was signed, Liam sat in his car and cried for 20 minutes, not because of the money, but because for the first time, the world had looked at him and seen potential instead of a problem. The next 5 years blurred into a whirlwind of sleepless nights, exhilarating highs, and crushing setbacks, each one carving Liam into someone he barely recognized when he caught his reflection in the glass walls of his high-rise office. Ledger Light exploded faster than anyone predicted, morphing from a garage project into a sleek, intuitive platform used by over 50,000 small businesses. And with that growth came a level of scrutiny Liam wasn't prepared for. Investors wanted meetings polished with corporate jargon he'd never learned in school. Journalists asked about his unconventional background, with a glint in their eyes, hungry for a dropout to CEO cliché, and worst of all, his old school. District reached out, inviting him to speak at their career day as a local success story, an offer that made him laugh bitterly into his coffee. He declined, but the invitation lingered in his mind like a ghost, dragging him back to memories of crowded hallways where teachers would side-eye him as he passed, of the way Mr. Dalton's voice had dripped with condescension when he'd announced to the class that some people are just destined to work with their hands. But the universe had a cruel sense of humor because just as Liam was finalizing plans for Ledger Light's new headquarters, a sprawling glass and steel campus in the very town he'd once fled, his HR director slid a stack of job applications. Across his desk, and there, nestled between overqualified MBA grads and eager young coders, were 3 names that sent a jolt through his body: Daniel Dalton, Martha Reeves, and Helen Cho, his former math teacher, the English instructor who'd once sighed and said, "I'd give you extra credit if I thought it would help," and the guidance counselor who'd rubber-stamped his withdrawal forms without a single question. The applications were for Ledger Light's new training division, a team tasked with onboarding new hires and fostering company culture. And as Liam stared at the papers, his fingers trembling slightly, he realized this was the moment he'd fantasized about during all those lonely nights in detention, the chance to stand in judgment of the people who'd judged him. But revenge, he discovered, wasn't the fiery rush he'd imagined. It was a quiet, gnawing uncertainty. That night, he drove past his old high school, its brick walls unchanged, its windows glowing under the Friday night football lights, and for the first time, he wondered if the system had failed his teachers as much as it had failed him. The next morning, he emailed HR, "Schedule interviews with all 3. I'll handle them myself." The morning of the interviews arrived with a heavy, almost theatrical tension, like the air before a storm. Liam had deliberately chosen the most imposing conference room in Ledger Light's temporary office space, its walls lined with floor-to-ceiling, windows that flooded the space with unforgiving light, the long glass table reflecting every nervous twitch of the applicants seated across from him. He'd worn a suit for the first time in years, not because he needed to impress them, but because he wanted them to see him, really see him, not as the slouching kid in the back row, but as the man who held their futures in his hands. Mr. Dalton was first. The man had aged, his hair thinner, his shoulders slightly stooped, but his sharp, assessing gaze was the same one that had once made Liam's stomach knot during pop quizzes. When Dalton walked in, his polished shoes clicking against the hardwood, he froze for a fraction of a second at the sight of Liam at the head of the table, his lips parting in something between recognition and disbelief. Liam let the silence stretch, watching the sweat bead at Dalton's temple before he finally gestured to the chair. "Sit." The interview was brutal in its simplicity. Liam didn't ask about qualifications or experience. Instead, he slid a ledger across the table, a real one from a local bakery using Ledger Light, and said, "Fix it." Dalton's hands shook as he fumbled with the numbers, his once confident voice stumbling over explanations that sounded rehearsed, hollow. Liam watched, his expression unreadable, as the man who'd once declared him a failure now struggled under the weight of his own inadequacy. Then came Ms. Reeves, her once severe bun now streaked with gray, her posture rigid as if bracing for attack, Liam handed her a training manual and asked her to explain a complex concept in terms a struggling student could understand. She faltered, her words stiff and overly technical, until Liam cut her off with, "If you can't simplify it, you don't understand it." Finally, Ms. Cho, the guidance counselor who'd dismissed him with a shrug, sat across from him, her smile strained. Liam didn't ask her a single question about the job. Instead, he said, "Oh, tell me about the kid you gave up on." The silence that followed was deafening. The weight of Liam's question hung in the air like a guillotine blade suspended mid-fall, and Ms. Cho's carefully composed professional mask cracked in real time. Her lips pressed into a thin line, her fingers tightening around the edge of the table as if bracing against a physical blow. For a long, excruciating moment, she said nothing, her gaze darting from Liam's impassive face to the sleek Ledger Light logo on the wall behind him, the irony of the situation settling over her like a suffocating blanket. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper, stripped of the practiced, placating tone she'd used in countless parent-teacher conferences. "There was a boy," she began, her words measured, hesitant, as if each one cost her something. Brilliant, but angry. He'd been failed so many times, by the system, by his family, by teachers like me, that he'd stopped trying altogether. I could have fought for him. I should have. But it was easier to assume he was just another lost cause. She didn't say Liam's name. She didn't need to. The admission was a raw, ugly thing, and it changed something in the room. Shifted. The balance of power in a way Liam hadn't anticipated. He'd expected vindication, the sweet rush of watching them squirm, but instead he felt something uncomfortably close to pity. These people weren't the villains of his story. They were bit players in a broken system, just as trapped as he'd been. Across the table, Dalton's jaw clenched, his pride warring with something that looked suspiciously like shame. "I was wrong about you," he muttered, the words dragged out of him like shrapnel from a wound. "But you already knew that." Liam leaned back in his chair, studying them. The defeated slump of Reeves's shoulders, the way Cho couldn't meet his eyes, the quiet fury in Dalton's admission. He'd spent years imagining this moment, rehearsing the cutting remarks he'd make, the way he'd make them beg. But now that it was here, the fantasy felt hollow, childish. The truth was, he didn't need their apologies. He'd outgrown them. Still, there was one question left unanswered. "Why apply here?" Liam asked, his voice softer now, almost curious. Dalton barked a laugh, bitter and self-deprecating. "The district laid off half the staff last year. Budget cuts. Turns out, being a respected educator doesn't mean much when you're 53 and competing with fresh grads who'll work for half your salary." Reeves nodded, her composure crumbling. "I've been substitute teaching for minimum wage. When I saw Ledger Light was hiring, I thought—" She cut herself off, shaking her head. "It doesn't matter what I thought." Liam exhaled slowly, the pieces clicking into place. They weren't here because they'd recognized him. They were here because they were desperate. And wasn't that the cruelest joke of all? The system had chewed them up and spat them out, just like it had done to him. Liam stood in the empty hallway outside the conference room, his palms pressed against the cold glass wall as he stared at the city skyline without really seeing it. His mind racing, his chest tight with a conflict he hadn't anticipated. He'd spent years replaying this moment in his head, imagining the look on Dalton's face when he'd finally have the power to reject him the way he'd been rejected, to make him feel small and worthless, to carve his victory into their pride, like a knife. But now that it was here, the fantasy felt hollow, almost childish. The truth was, these people weren't the monsters he'd built them up to be in his memories. They were just flawed, aging humans who'd been chewed up by the same broken system that had nearly destroyed him. Dalton's hands had trembled during the interview. Reeves had bitten her lip raw with nerves. Cho had looked at him with something worse than fear. remorse, deep and unflinching. And the realization hit him like a punch to the gut. He didn't want revenge. He wanted something far more dangerous. He wanted to change the game entirely. The idea unfurled in his mind, wild and uncharted. A plan so audacious it made his pulse spike. What if he didn't fire them? What if he didn't humiliate them? What if, instead, he handed them the very tools they'd denied him? Trust, resources, a second chance, and forced them to reckon with what they'd done. His fingers tightened around his phone as he scrolled to the only number that had never judged him. Mr. Riley, the janitor who'd sneaked him sandwiches when he'd missed lunch, who'd winked and said, "The world's going to hear you roar someday, kid." The old man answered on the second ring, his voice a gravelly comfort. "Knew you'd call," he said, as if he'd been waiting. Liam exhaled, the words tumbling out in a rush. "What if I hire them?" Riley's laughter was warm, knowing. "You already decided, Liam. You just needed someone to tell you it ain't weak to be the bigger man." The line went dead, and Liam turned back toward the conference room, his jaw set. This wasn't forgiveness. This wasn't surrender. This was war fought on his terms. And for the first time in his life, he held all the weapons. The conference room door creaked as Liam pushed it open, the sound slicing through the thick silence where his former teachers sat frozen. Dalton gripping his resume with white-knuckled intensity, Reeves nervously straightening her blazer, for the 10th time. Cho staring at her hands like they held answers she couldn't decipher. For one excruciating moment, Liam let them stew in the uncertainty, watching the way Dalton's throat worked as he swallowed hard, the way Reeves's knee bounced under the table, the subtle tremor in Cho's fingers as she reached for her water glass. These were the people who'd once held his future in their hands like it was worthless scrap paper, who'd scribbled their judgments in red ink and sealed his fate with dismissive shrugs. Now the power dynamic had shifted so violently it was almost cruel, but cruelty wasn't what tightened Liam's chest as he finally spoke. "You spent your careers deciding who was worthy of success," he said, his voice low but carrying the weight of every detention slip, every failed exam, every muttered, "he'll never amount to anything," that had chased him through adolescence. "So here's your final test." He dropped 3 thick folders onto the table, each emblazoned with Ledger Light's logo, a stylized lighthouse, its beam cutting through darkness. Inside were blueprints for something far bigger than any of them had anticipated. The Second Chance Initiative, a radical corporate education partnership that would embed Ledger Light's trainers in struggling schools, not to teach coding or business, but to identify kids slipping through the cracks the way Liam had, not with standardized tests, but with hands-on projects, mentorship, and real-world problems to solve. Dalton was the first to react, his weathered face draining of color as he flipped through the proposal. "You want us to prove you actually learned something from failing me?" Liam interrupted, stepping closer until his shadow fell across Dalton's trembling hands. "The district already approved the pilot program. You'll report directly to me. 1 year. Show me you can spot potential where you once saw hopelessness." The unspoken threat hung in the air. "And if you can't, you'll never work in this town again." But then came the twist they never saw coming. Liam reached into his pocket and slid 3 envelopes across the table, personal checks, each matching. The annual salary they'd made at the height of their teaching careers. "Back pay," he said simply. "For every student you wrote off who could have been me." Cho made a wet, choked sound, her composure shattering as she realized the checks weren't punitive. They were seed funding for scholarships in their names. Reeves burst into tears. Dalton just sat there, staring at his own signature line where Liam had already filled in the amount, his entire world view collapsing under the weight of that grotesque, beautiful number. And as Liam turned to leave, he paused at the door, throwing his final words over his shoulder like a lit match. "Welcome to the first day of your real education."
Subscribe and press the bell icon so that you never miss the amazing video.